And reflection of the Utrecht University. My name is Laura Mol. I work as a programmer for Studium Generale. Not like a programmer, but more like I organize these events. And I'm also your host tonight. I'm seeing a lot of people in the audience. I'm so glad. I'm also seeing some new faces, I think. So who's here for the first time? Ah, good. A lot of people. Great to see you. So for those of you who don't know, we organize public events with scientists and thinkers at the interface of science and society, including lectures, talk shows, and movie screenings. So if you want to stay up to date, you can subscribe to our newsletter via the website. And usually I say follow us on social media. But now I don't know, so you do whatever you feel comfortable with. So all of our events are live streamed and they can be watched on demand via YouTube. So everyone watching at home now, hi to you too. Feel free to drop a question in the chat and it will come to me via my phone. And before I talk a little bit more about today's topic, I am really curious as who you are. So I'm not going to ask all of you individually, but I'm just going to try and see if I can find out how well-versed in tech you are. So who of you uses ChatGPT or other generative AI models? Yeah, quite a few people. So what do you use it for?
I work for a company, a US-based company that develops a lot of these foundational models. So if you want to do something with AI, then you can use our products to build that.
Yeah, so you from Gen AI say use Gen I.
It depends.
Yeah, oh, it depends. Okay, so what does it depend on?
I think in general, it's a problem that most of these foundational models have their provenance in the US. Mm-hmm. And we rely on US servers, or Chinese ones if you go to deep sea. Mm-hmm. But yeah, you don't really know what's going on in the back end if you don't host it yourself.
Yeah, so what are you hoping to hear tonight?
Just curious to hear some more diverse perspectives, especially from a non-US angle, I should say.
Great. Anyone else who doesn't use AI at all? You don't want? Okay, sure. Is anyone here like a coder? Does somebody do coding here? Do you What are you hoping to hear tonight?
In a perfect scenario, I would like to hear that EU would be developing their own telecommunications app system, let's say, even AI models.
Yeah, so you're also looking for non-US alternatives.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. All right, thank you. So I organized this event about tech bros together with Thomas van Manen, who also works here at the Library Utrecht. And it was after watching Trump's inauguration with all the tech bros on the front row, and the many breaking headlines that followed about TikTok bans and AI taking over jobs, a Facebook lawsuit, and of course Elon Musk taking over government agencies, that we decided that some in-depth academic explanation was needed. Because what is happening and why? What are the tech bros after, and how do they use their political and financial power to achieve their goals? I think most of us use their products daily, so should we stop doing that? And can we protect ourselves on an EU level, on a national level, and on an individual level against their plans? So thankfully, the Utrecht University has a wonderful lineup of researchers that can provide us with explanation. And we asked two of them to give us some guidance. We have Dr. Taylor Annabel. She is a social media researcher who studies social media platforms, how they make money, how content makers or influencers make money, and how that can be regulated. And we also have Dr. Fabian Ferrari with us. He's an assistant professor specialized in cultural artificial intelligence. He knows a lot about how big tech companies like Amazon, Google, and Microsoft have their part in the AI industry, and what this means for social structures and cultural life. So both will give a short 20-minute presentation to set us up for a discussion part, where we will look at some recent headlines. And of course, you're very welcome to share and participate in the discussion. So if you have any remarks or questions, worries, or optimistic outlooks, you are very welcome. So first, let's give a warm welcome to Taylor for her presentation on tech bros and social media governance.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's so nice to be here with you. And thank you, Laura, for the invitation to be part of this event. As Laura mentioned, I do research that focuses on social media platforms. I'm interested in the creator economy. So this is the way that cultural production is being shaped by creators, by influencers who generate an income through what they are sharing and posting on platforms. And I also do research about platform governance. So that's the way that platforms will establish their own rules. They act as private governors of these social spaces that we interact with online. And then the way that regulation also governs what social media platforms can do. And I also do a little bit of work too on how users experience and perceive what's going on. So what I have for you today is I want to start off with the figure of the tech bro and thinking a bit about how we can situate them in platform society and in the creator economy. Then I'm going to look at a few examples of shifts that we've seen in terms of social media platforms and the way that they're governed in light of the Trump administration. And then finally, I'm going to offer 3 ways in which we might think about responses that we can have if we want to perhaps change the relationship that we have to social media platforms in particular. So to start us off, the figure of the tech bro. I want us to think about them as both celebrities within platform society, as well as these key actors within the creator economy. So what I have for you here is kind of a sketch, perhaps, of what platform society might look like for us here in the EU. And platform society is a concept that asks us to think about the relationship between social structures and different types of platforms, this kind of global ecosystem that we've become situated within. That platforms are increasingly structuring and shaping our social and our economic life. We're becoming dependent on them in particular ways. They're amassing all sorts of power, particularly as they expand across industries and then buy up their competitors. And something I think that's really critical that we consider when we look at platforms is the way that they're these multi-sided markets. That when you and I perhaps use some of these platforms, we think about how they shape the interactions we have with other users and with the content that we see. But they're also catering towards other really critical user groups, people like advertisers and data companies. And they're really concerned with these users, perhaps more so than us, because this is what their business models depend upon. So if we think about this platform society here in the EU, I've got some numbers for you in terms of average monthly users, according to what the platforms are saying about their own digital services, as they report them to the European Commission. And that's because you might be aware that within the EU, we have kind of an update to our platform liability regulation called the Digital Services Act. And one of the things that does is it says, okay, we have some platforms that have a lot of users, that they've amassed a lot of power, and so they need to be they need to take on additional responsibility and they have certain obligations. And this pertains to kind of online hosting platforms, so social media platforms, marketplaces, search engines, these types of ones. So as soon as you hit 45 million users in the EU, if you're one of these online platforms or search engines, you become classified in this way. And here you can see all the ones that we have. It's quite a mixture of them. You may have some of these very ones on your phone. And if we return back a few months ago to the inauguration, you can see that some of those digital services that are dominating our ecosystem were there sitting alongside Trump. So I've given you here these tech bros. That's the founders, the CEOs, the people who are regulating the social media platforms in which they are in charge of. And here they are bolded out. So millions and millions of users in the hands of those tech bros. And so we had a whole lot of distinctive images, I think, that emerged over the Trump inauguration that made visible things that perhaps were a little bit not so specifically big tech has been lobbying governments, wanting their interests to be represented in new regulation. Perhaps if we go back a little bit further, if we think about social media platforms now as a space that exists within the media industry, we could think about issues of concentrations of ownership, that some of these problems predate the arrival of the tech bros. But this might also be a moment in which something novel and distinctive is going on when we think about the kind of proximity that's on display in the inauguration, that they don't just have a seat at the table, they're part of joining Trump in his agenda potentially. So I think this is a moment for us to reflect on the kind of social and political context in which we're in and think about what it means that some of these tech bros have a potential relationship with the Trump administration, what that might mean for the way that regulation happens. And as we've heard recently, particularly led by Mark Zuckerberg, who's calling on Trump to represent their interests as American companies, particularly when it comes to the EU and how the EU is potentially going to issue fines and have real implications when it comes to the Digital Services Act and the Digital Market Act. So tech bros or tech founders are something that people in academia have been thinking about, have been looking at. And here I think the work of Ben Little and Alison Winch is really useful. They've done this analysis where they've looked at, in the US context, who tech founders are. What kind of biographies do they have? How are they connected and networked to one another? So this is a diagram that they have where they think about these kind of rivalries and friendships and relationships that emerge. And the thing that I think is really nice about their work is that they both look at the individual and they look at these patterns that emerge. What makes a tech bro a tech bro? What kind of ideologies do they share? This is particularly gendered. A particular form of masculinity emerges, the kind of narrative around the boy genius who is very interested in tech, who is a bit nerdy, who then goes on to amass a lot of power through kind of deliberate maneuvers. And so they trace some of these deliberate maneuvers, things like resisting state intervention, deliberately ignoring or downplaying the kind of regulatory obligations that they may have. And they share this kind of metaphor that they use, these tech founders, around the colonial frontier, that data capitalism is this new frontier that needs to be conquered. And another thing that they do in this work that I think is really useful for us is they point to this kind of celebrity status that these tech founders rely on to legitimate their power. And I think we can take this a little bit further and thinking about how they use their own social media platforms to represent themselves, to show us something about who they are, to attach a particular self-brand to the brand of the social media platforms in which they control. So here I have an example for you from Mark Zuckerberg. Unlike perhaps many of us, he's still quite an active user of Facebook. He's modeling to us what it means to be an ideal user, creating a lot of content, generating a lot of data. So this is all the posts that he's done since last May. And the colors here represent the kind of different types of content that he's producing. He's sharing things about his personal life. He's a father. He's a husband. He likes MMA. He likes to play video games. Sometimes he'll go to a concert. He's been recovering from an injury. All these stories he's telling, these moments of his life that give him a particular character, a particular flavor of tech bro, a particular performance of masculinity. And interspersed with this, he's also offering updates about what's happening in Meta. Meta is a company, so here is our quarterly reports, and then Meta products. So this is where we're at with our AI models. Here's where we're at with our glasses. And you see this example here at the bottom where he's with his wife. They've just been at a fight, and he's wearing the glasses. He's doing this kind of branded content. And so what we see is that some of these tech bros emulate the practices of influencers to demonstrate to us how you should be using their platform, blending together your personal and your professional life. And Mark along with many of the tech bros, has very complementary things to say about the creator economy. The creator economy is a space in which rivals the media industry. This is the creators are the people who we should trust. These are the new cultural elites. And it makes sense that they say this sort of stuff because they have a very vested interest, particularly with Mark, having Facebook and Instagram in the Meta umbrella, that they want the creator economy to be the place that people are turning to get their news. And these quotes that I have for you on the screen, these come from an interview that Mark is giving, or a kind of conversation he's having with Joe Rogan, a podcaster. And so it's not just that Mark Zuckerberg is embracing the creator economy, but he's actively participating in it. This is the space in which he's giving long-form interviews, unlike to journalists. And there are a number of interesting things that come out of this interview that he gives earlier this year. He's talking about the need for us to embrace a more masculine corporate culture because culture is becoming neutered. And he's also sharing changes that Meta is making around their policy, that he re-narrativizes Meta's previous policies around moderation, that wasn't moderation, that was actually censorship. And we shouldn't be doing fact-checking anymore because that's a bit too biased, that's ideologically driven. Instead, we're going to embrace a community notes style, echoing what Musk has done with X. And so this is the space in which he provides that context to complement the press releases that come with it. Now, Joe Rogan is perhaps a name that might be familiar to you. He is the most listened to podcaster on Spotify 4 years in a row. And he also has a particular place at the inauguration. Here he is, sitting here at the bottom. He's not the only influencer who is there. And if we think about what happened in the kind of lead up to the election, the politicization of influencers, the way that I think almost 60 million people have viewed on YouTube the episode that he did with Trump. We can think about the way that the creator economy, perhaps something that we might trivialize, we might think, oh, these are just influencers, can take on a particular effect. Okay, so I already mentioned that Zuckerberg earlier this year announced that they were stopping fact-checking on Meta platforms in the US. So we'll see that's currently kind of being phased in. It's yet to be totally realized. But there are a few adjustments that I think we can observe in terms of what social media platforms are doing in terms of governance in this kind of Trump era. So to stick with Meta again, and their kind of thinking and changes in thinking about what sort of speech is acceptable. One of the big changes that they made on the 7th of January was around their hateful conduct policy. And here you can see the changelog from their website in which certain text has been added and certain text has been removed. And the critical thing here is that they're kind of opening up free speech, if you will, but the way that that is happening is enabling more speech that would challenge the legitimacy of the queer community and LGBTQ+ rights. And so we could think about how that perhaps is in line with particular ideologies. That policy, that tiny policy change, can be situated in this wide network of what we call platform documentation. And this is a term that we're using to think about the kind of contractual relationship that we have as users of a platform with the platform. Because platforms are increasingly owned by these private companies who have corporate interests, they get to act as governors of these public spaces. They can unilaterally establish the rules in which we must abide by. Often we think about this in terms of terms and conditions, but there's a slight paradigm shift in which we're not just dealing with one document that says, this is how you behave on the platform, this is how your data is being used, this is how we're going to moderate you. As these platforms grow and grow and grow, we see the documentation also explode. So if you're a user of Instagram or of Facebook, you become part of this web. You're probably a more kind of ordinary user, so then just the blue dots and the purple ones apply to you. But all the advertisers on the platform, the creators, the sellers, they're also needing to navigate all these rules. And we can think about particular hierarchies that might emerge in terms of who's getting perhaps more favorable terms than we are. And so I think this is something we need to keep in mind, right? That when we sign up to kind of this huge, complex, messy system. The second example I want to offer you around changes that have happened in our kind of Trump era relates to TikTok and something that happened at the start of this year, the so-called TikTok ban, which was in effect for 14 hours. We'll see how long the kind of extension extends. But I think something that is worth noting. Oh, come back. Oh, no. Sorry. Okay, is the notifications that US users received. When the platform went down, they were told, don't worry, President Trump may have a solution. And when it returned 14 hours later, he was also deliberately mentioned within this. And I think this kind of overt signaling through notifications says something about the role of political endorsement within this space. That it is not just a tech bro endorsing a particular individual, but it is now a platform that is baking it into the kind of notifications it sends. Another kind of interesting thing that happens just in the wake of the TikTok ban that happened and then didn't happen was that people became increasingly aware of how particular terms, political terms or politicized terms, might be being moderated in particular ways. So I have a screenshot here in the middle with, if you're a Taylor Swift fan, you might recognize it. The name of one of her songs is The Smallest Man Who Ever Lived. And you can see that when this user has typed this into the search bar on TikTok, it has changed man to woman. And this was something that was discussed as like deliberate intervention of the platform, that people made sense of this by looking at what was happening between Cho, TikTok, and the US government. And this kind of algorithmic assumptions that circulate on platforms like TikTok, as well as on X, on the Meta platforms, in which ordinary users are becoming increasingly aware that there is a geopolitical context that has emerged around their use, around the way that moderation is taking place. And this is not something that has just happened all of a sudden this year. For a long time, people across the political spectrum have been asking questions about how moderation decisions might be tied to particular political ideologies. And I think it's worth noting that even if these are described as glitches, and maybe are glitches, that they are being experienced as meaningful and being attributed to changes in governance. Okay, so is there anything that we can do about it? I'm not going to give you magic solutions. If that was what you were hoping for, I apologize. But let me offer kind of 3 levels of observation about what kind of responses exist out there to tech bros and what they're doing with social media platforms. The first area I want to draw attention to is the kind of way we may have choices as users who have these platforms. And here I think it's a bit tricky to talk about empowerment, which is the language that the platforms would also often like us to use, because how empowered can we be when we are limited to within kind of a data capitalist structure? Nevertheless, a lot of the EU regulations, so the Digital Services Act that I mentioned earlier, the Digital Markets Act, has been attempting to offer to require platforms to offer users more levers of control, more transparency about what's going on. So I have 4 examples for you up here. Some of this is around giving you transparency around if your content is moderated, why it was moderated, how you have options to appeal it, why you might be seeing advertising, how you might have some level of control or choice around the level of personalization. You can see what kind of ad topics, for example, you're being targeted with. If you see something that you think is illegal content, you can report it. And again, we could reflect to what extent is this meaningful, but that's all to say, because of new EU regulations, your platforms might look a little bit different, that you could explore the new options available to you. Then at kind of a larger scale, we have ways in which those very large online platforms now have to comply with a whole lot of different obligations. So to give you an example of what that looks like, they have to do risk assessment. So the platform has to look at the way that it's designed and the way that it's being used and say, okay, what kind of risks exist, and then they have to account for how they're mitigating those risks. So we've just had at the end of last year these 100-page documents from all the platforms being released. They're subject now to independent auditors who have to go through all of these obligations and these risk assessments and then assess whether they think they're in compliance. So we have this kind of sprawling compliance industry where we may have more transparency about what's going on. And again, we've been doing some analysis in our team about, especially with the audit reports, what's going on, and we can question, what does this transparency do for us, right? Okay, we might now know some more stuff, but is that useful in terms of meaningful change? And then the other thing to note is that the European Commission has opened a lot of proceedings with a lot of these companies, including TikTok, Meta, X, and it'll be interesting to see, given especially the US-based ones, with this pressure that the tech bros are placing on the US government, how the European Commission chooses to handle perhaps enforcement. Then the final thing I wanted to offer you is around how we have options as users perhaps to look outside the tech bro ecosystem, to migrate elsewhere. And so 2 examples of this is Signal, so an alternative instant messaging app, or Blue Sky as an alternative social networking site. And we've seen huge waves of migration from there. The thing that I would like us to consider when we look at alternatives is reflecting on how those operations, what kind of business models they rely on. So Signal is relying at the moment on donations in order to sustain its operations. And Blue Sky at the moment is funded through venture capital and is kind of dabbling with subscriptions. So the question is, as more people perhaps join these platforms because they offer better privacy, because they're not run by billionaires, because they do not have advertising, but they scale up, more people need to be employed, moderation at scale becomes an issue. What sustainability looks like in this space? Can we think outside of the advertising model in order to have platforms in which the way our data is being used and treated is a bit more equitable? So those were the thoughts that I hope give you something to consider. Thank you so much.
Before we go to Fabian's presentation, I think I want to give you a chance. If you want to ask Taylor already a question, then you can raise your hand. I see one. Okay, so I'm going to throw this. Not all the way back, but maybe somebody can catch it in the middle.
I miss Palantir from how do you J.D. Vance and Peter Thiel in this.
Yeah, she's mentioning Palantir, that other company, but I think that maybe Fabian. I see. Do you want to comment on Palantir or not?
No, I think I'll leave that to Fabian.
Okay, great.
Sorry.
Yeah. Anyone else? A question for Taylor? Yeah, here in the front. Okay. Oh.
If I look to the numbers you showed, it feels like a war is going on, and we are reacting with paper. Do you have also some more aggressive things which we should do?
Oh, well, I mean, I think the great thing about having access to these numbers is that we previously didn't have them. So if they were publicly listed companies, they would report perhaps on their overall user base. But knowing what's happening within the EU is really valuable in terms of regulators having power. But for TikTok, for example, we didn't know how many users existed because unless that is valuable for their financial position, they're not disclosing this. So I think getting a sense of scale has been very valuable. And then the question becomes, how do you do something about companies that aren't located within your territory and the kind of risks that may come with that on a geopolitical spectrum. And we can see, and I think anticipate, the way that enforcement of the DSA and the DMA, which are really trying to deal with the power that these companies have, will become entangled with the tariff discussion that's going on. And so they'll become a bargaining chip, I anticipate.
Thank you.
So do I understand correctly that all these numbers were secretive? They were hidden for us?
Yes, this was not something that they were needed to disclose.
Okay.
But now we have quite granular details about how many moderators exist within the Netherlands or will be moderating Dutch content, for example, across these platforms because they have to report on that. So we do have access to reporting numbers. We have no idea how accurate they are, but numbers now exist. So that's something, maybe.
Small steps. Okay, so I want to ask Fabian to come join us on the stage. Can you give me that one?
Okay.
Yeah, I have big shoes to fill because I think Taylor already covered a really broad range of topics and interesting things. So what do I want to add, or what can I add in my talk? I really want to talk about tech bros and the AI race, and then make the key argument that the EU, if we want to challenge tech bros and big tech, it's not enough to challenge on economic level. We also need to challenge them intellectually, develop ideas that can provide an alternative to tech bro ideology. Because a lot of what tech bros are doing seems pretty random. If you read the news, there's developments that nobody would expect, and it all seems random. But it's not random. There is a deeper philosophy behind it, and I'll try to explain it in a little bit. But first, a little bit about the geopolitical context, because Taylor was already mentioning that, and we had some questions and points about the role of the European Union already. So these days, you hear a lot about an AI arms race between two technological superpowers, really, the US and China. So it's about AI investments. The most famous models are all American, and of course we have DeepSeek as well. Where are the European models? Well, Europe really appears more as a regulator, like a player that sets the boundaries for companies to operate. That with the AI Act, for example, imposes fines on companies, categorizes AI systems into different risk levels. So it's more about regulation. There's not really a good alternative. But the EU is trying to change that, to really move from the regulation role to the investor role. So investing more money. That's a big shift happening politically. Regulation was in the past 5 years. I've been studying that. I was very interested in it. But now we have a big shift from regulation to investment. So here we see the Commissioner Virkkonen, who is responsible for digital and sovereignty topics, announcing the AI Continent Action Plan. It involves, for example, 20 billion euro investment in AI gigafactories, so computing facilities for AI development, but also what they call regulatory simplification. So making the AI Act a bit more softening the AI Act because there's concern of over-regulation, too much regulation. So it's about loosening that regulation a little bit. So the AI Continent Action Plan was announced as the largest public investment in AI. So it was really marketed as this amazing amount of money, 20 billion in factories, which sounds like a lot of money. Well, let's put it in context. Actually, the plant is a bit in the way here, so maybe let's move the plant. AI and sustainability doesn't work anyway, so just remove the plant. Thank you so much, Laura. So 20 billion euros sounds like a lot, and it was marketed like a lot. Well, let's compare it to Saudi Arabia, for example, 100 billion. Who else do we have? What do you think? Maybe China. 130. So I'm cherry picking a bit here. It's about recent announcement of infrastructure investment. Then, of course, we have the US with the so-called Stargate project. So I think you just said we're having a war and we're fighting it with paper. Well, it's not a lot of paper. It's just a tiny amount when you compare it to the technological superpowers. So I would argue when you look at that numbers, the competition is lost. There's no way to keep up. Of course, you can invest more money, but what will happen is that the US and China will invest even more. So competing purely in budgetary terms is a lost race. It's too late. The big tech companies are too strong for that. The infrastructural dependencies are too ingrained. If you invest more money, you're going to subsidize the big tech companies even more. So if you can't compete on budgets, I think you need to compete on values. And that's where the competitive advantage of Europe could be. Competing in terms of values, challenging big tech, also intellectually, philosophically. So before talking a bit about that, let's talk about who are the most prominent AI tech bros. I think most of you know this guy, Sam Altman from OpenAI. We, of course, have Mark Zuckerberg here, portrayed in the Joe Rogan podcast. They have a language model called Llama, which is actually a more open approach. ChatGPT is more closed. Llama you can modify a little bit more. Bit of different approach. We have XAI by Elon Musk with the model Grok. And Grok is famous for, well, not having any safety filters, eliminating the Vogue Mind virus. So being a bit more rogue model. We also have Demis Hassabis here from Google DeepMind. Google has also a powerful model called Gemini, especially good for science. And maybe some of you don't know this person, but that's Dario Amodei from Anthropic. And Anthropic also developed a very powerful model, which is very much used by current AI developers in Silicon Valley. It's called Claude, and it's very famous in Silicon Valley. A lot of tech bros actually use it themselves. So that's the dimension of models. But there's not just models in the AI industry. It's not enough to just look at models. You also need to look at infrastructure. So NVIDIA, for example, here with Jensen Huang, was actually one of the main companies that benefited from the AI boom, because the generative AI development always relies on so-called graphic processing units, GPUs. And NVIDIA is the market leader in GPUs. Initially, they were developed for video games, but programmers found out that AI development runs really well on these GPUs. So that's why the NVIDIA stock, if you look at it, after ChatGPT release, really went up. So Jensen Huang, very important. We also have Satya Nadella from Microsoft. Microsoft has an exclusive partnership with OpenAI. If you have Microsoft Office, you will see Copilot, and Copilot runs on OpenAI. So you get the message. Microsoft is a key infrastructure player here as well. And of course, Amazon with Amazon Web Services, key player in infrastructure. If people need more data centers, if people deploy AI, they always require infrastructure as well. So that's why Amazon is also a key beneficiary from AI. So that's just to give you an overview of the AI industry. Key takeaway is not just about models, it's also about infrastructure. Now let's talk about how economic power and cultural power relate to each other in the AI space. And for that, I have some notes as well, because I'm talking about the philosophy here of tech bros, and some of that is quite obscure. So I actually have some notes about that. So I think we can imagine here the power of big tech in the AI industry, also like an iceberg. So we have the visible side of economic power and the invisible side of cultural power. So economic power, of course, you can measure in terms of stocks, in terms of industry, acquisitions, campaign donations, and so on. So it's quite easy to measure. But how do you measure the influence of somebody shaping what intelligence is on a more cultural level? And that's really the key point. There's an ideology here, an intellectual movement behind the actions of tech bros. Not all tech bros are the same. It's not a unified movement, and it's not perfectly understood yet. But I think we need to challenge them intellectually as well, not just by investing more money, but also by scrutinizing deeper ideas about tech. But before that, it's important to remember that it's not the first time in history that wealthy tech bros or steel bros, like Andrew Carnegie here, actually get so much power, so much economic power, that they can also shape cultural life more broadly. And Carnegie here was really a really wealthy man. He basically helped to build the American steel industry. I actually used the example of Carnegie at the beginning of my PhD to develop an analogy between the steel empire and the AI empire. That is not the first time there was that much power. So Carnegie was not free from ideology. Here I have a very interesting quote that actually shows some of his thinking in the famous essay, The Gospel of Wealth. So he said, "We welcome inequality of environment, the concentration of business, industrial and commercial, in the hands of a few, and the law of competition between these as being not only beneficial, but essential for the future progress of the race." So it's a pretty social Darwinistic mindset. The idea that the biological concept of natural selection and survival of the fittest should actually be applied to human societies as well. And some people argue that Carnegie's thinking was really relevant in getting the idea out that capitalists, not workers, are the ones that produce wealth and prosperity. So really the idea is that factory owners, like Carnegie, produce wealth, not the people working in the steel factories. And I think that's how we can relate Carnegie to today's big tech bros as well. Carnegie also had an infrastructural function for American culture by investing in universities, by investing in institutions, in terms of his philanthropy. And that's why it's important to compare Carnegie here also to specific figures like Elon Musk. And I try to portray him in a similar aesthetic here. Not sure if that worked, but AI was used, so I want to admit that here. And there are two quotes that I would like to highlight in relation to Musk, to maybe relate him a little bit to Carnegie's thinking. And the first one is, "The fundamental weakness of Western civilization is empathy. The Democrats are exploiting a bug in Western civilization, which is the empathy response." So Musk really speaks about suicidal civilizational empathy, mostly in relation to immigration. So it's much more extreme than Carnegie's thinking. And Musk is not just critiquing one policy, he is diagnosing a flaw in the operating system of the West, which is empathy, a system that prioritizes feeling over function and softness over strength. And Musk also, in his second quote here, draws a direct line between this moral weakness and the efficiency or inefficiency of government. So he says it's a false dichotomy to look at government and industry as separate. Government is the ultimate corporation. Very important, ultimate corporation. It should get out of the way and not impede progress. So he's saying basically that government operates like a company, like a really big, inefficient company. That's why it needs to be fixed with the Department of Government Efficiency. It's very, I think, crucial to see that. A government manages people, resources, money, and rules, like a firm. And government rules, regulation, slow down innovation. And the best thing the government can do is to step aside and let technological development run freely. So this, I think, reflects Musk's belief in acceleration, that faster progress in terms of tech leads to a better future. And regulation, in his view, is a burden, it's an obstacle in this way. So that's about Musk. But there are some other obscure figures in what is sometimes called the Dark Enlightenment. Maybe you heard in the news the term connected to the current techbro thinking. This is Curtis Yavin, who expressed the idea of the government as a corporation even 15 years before Musk. So he was a former software engineer and really one of the key thinkers in this Dark Enlightenment thinking. So the idea, the movement that rejects democracy and equality. And he also said, a state should be managed like any other large business by dividing logical ownership into negotiable shares, each of which yields a precise fraction of the state's profit. So you might think this idea is obscure or crazy even, extreme, but actually Yavin has some ties to some of the most powerful people in Silicon Valley. And there was a question about Peter Thiel. Well, there you have him. He's actually closely related in terms of thinking to these ideas. That the government is a corporation, the country is its property, shares in the state can be bought, sold, and traded, just like stock. And if the state exists to generate profit, not equality, justice, or freedom. So, if we now connect this to AI, I think there are a few key points. If you think that democracy is too slow, empathy is a bug, efficiency should be improved at any cost, and that progress shouldn't be slowed down by regulation, AI is the perfect tool for you as an autocratic thinker. AI lets you automate decision-making, optimize control, without asking people for permission. It might not be the perfect tool for everyone, but it works really well for efficiency, power, and those who are already in control of that power. So I think that's all some philosophical or intellectual background to contextualize current developments. So I think if we have this idea of the iceberg with the more visible economic side and the less visible cultural side, it's also important to connect announcements like 500 billion investment in AI, JD Vance warning about regulation, to the deeper invisible side of the iceberg. So for example, removal of safety filters in AI development, Musk warning about this virus in AI that is too vogue. And of course, what is currently happening at DOGE. So that really brings me to my conclusion, to see economic power and cultural power in AI as being related. If we want to challenge it in the EU, it's not enough to just invest more money. No, it's about developing better cultural ideas to really challenge that invisible iceberg side as well. And I look forward to your questions.
Yeah, so Taylor, come join us on the stage already. Is there anyone who has a question for Fabian before we start with some headlines? Yeah.
Thank you for your interesting talk. So how would you relate this to the AI Act and the fact that now EU wants to invest more and wants, it seems like, to run the race also with AI, while I think you're right and we shouldn't go that way, but then how should we approach? So, yeah.
I think the topic of public values is crucial here. So trying to relate or to apply public values on AI development, develop models that are in line with the values that we prefer. But of course, that's an open question, open for democratic negotiation. It shouldn't be defined by any academics, but it should ideally be part of a democratic deliberation. So I think my response here will not satisfy you, but I think it's open to debate. And that should be there shouldn't be billionaires in the EU deciding what to do, but really a collective process.
It's to society to discuss what kind of society we want to be and how AI plays a role in that.
Yeah, and if we want to use AI in the public sector, for example, in ministries, maybe we should think twice before using American models.
But we're already using them, and everyone's already used to ChatGPT and other kinds of models. So how can we unlearn those models? And
I think it's very hard because we also have to acknowledge that these products are working very well. Mm-hmm. In terms of convenience, they are very hard to beat. So it's very, very difficult to escape that as well.
Taylor, when you heard Fabian's story about the philosophy, the techbro philosophy, how do you see that philosophy reflected in social media platforms?
Yeah, I think this point that Fabian makes about needing that we shouldn't only think about what the kind of economic model is, but the kind of cultural ideology that underpins it is also vital when it comes to social media platforms, and perhaps thinking about the kind of ideological underpinnings of that becomes a little bit simpler. I mean, even if we go back to Zuckerberg's hot or not kind of foundation in terms of, you know, what are social media platforms intended to do, and how are we thinking about classifying people and
Can you explain the hot or not for people who are not like familiar with Facebook's history?
Well, the myth of the founding of Facebook is that Zuckerberg is creating a website in which he has 2 images of women at the university and asking people to rate which one is hotter, more attractive. And so this kind of pitting of humans against one another and making these quick judgments, creating this metrification model that we could trace perhaps to some of the ways that we interact with content still on social media, that we are quantifying ourselves in particular ways, that we are displaying publicly these metrics, that we are choosing to perhaps buy into this kind of way of seeing people and seeing the world, that they can be classified. Then if we think about the kind of datafication model that underpins advertising and personalization, again, this idea that we can understand people by the digital traces that they leave behind, that we can collate them in particular ways to understand them in order to distribute content to them, as well as ad targeting.
Yeah, and train AI on as well, but we'll get to that. Let's first start with the most, I think, famous and infamous tech bro of them all, which is Elon Musk, of course. I think most people will know him from being the head of X and SpaceX and Tesla, but he's also a senior advisor, like you just mentioned, to Trump. His role with DOGE is unclear, but he seems to be the de facto head of the company. I'm not going to move all these tables to read what it says there, but he's actually getting access to a lot of sensitive information of US citizens, and then he is preparing to unleash the AI, which sounds very ominous. What do you think he's doing with that information, and how will that influence AI?
You ask me a smaller question, please. But I think it's important. I think I was just looking at the number. When he was at Twitter, and he took over Twitter, he fired 80% of the workforce. Yeah. 80%. It's quite a big number. There are 2.3 million public sector employees in the US. And so far, I think 200K were either fired, earmarked for dismissal, or got a buyout. So it's still a small proportion. There's still a long way to go in terms of getting rid of people. Yeah. If you look at the history.
Yeah. So he's getting rid of people and he's trying to replace them with AI, or is he?
There's now a chatbot being used already by DOGE, introduced, called the GSAI chatbot. I was trying to find out who built it and what are the properties, but it's quite secretive. So a lot of these topics are so new and so ongoing that it's very difficult to find.
Yeah, and it's all happening very fast. That also seems to be deliberate, I think.
But the history of Twitter for me was already telling, because it shows where it might go.
Yeah. If anyone has a question, I see you. So, can you put the box to the front row? Thank you.
Yeah, the title of our discussion this evening is about the takeover by the tech bros. So I wonder if you could, both of the speakers, could prioritize the risk of a particular takeover. The takeover of what would you prioritize as number one? So please, could you comment on that?
I think given that I did a bit of I entered this rabbit hole of dark enlightenment thinking and the idea of the state as a corporation. And if that's a takeover that reaches Europe, or the idea reaches Europe, I think I would be more scared of the ideas coming instead of the AI, but then the ideas connect already to the AI. So it's impossible to distinguish. But I think this connection between these hardcore ideas and hardcore tech is a bad idea, and it's dangerous.
What's the number one takeover you
I think
are worried about?
I think the way that we might think about this being inevitable would be the kind of takeover, because I think if we consider social media as public spheres, public spaces, they've already been taken over by big tech. The takeover has happened. But I think this idea of being trapped within the takeover and being unable to imagine alternative solutions and to think outside the kind of business models that we have is the thing that's still at stake. That can we readjust our horizons? Can we consider alternatives? Do we take on the kind of, do we individualize the responsibility to say, okay, perhaps I will discontinue using certain platforms? Or does it feel like we're trapped and it's all kind of inevitable and we're stuck? Is perhaps something that we could consider as being at stake.
Yeah, so we'll get to both of these points. Let's first go to the dark enlightenment ideas and how they're already here, I think. It was the telecom CEO who also pleads for a sort of DOGE kind of approach, but in the EU. So it's already here.
Yeah, of course, it's coming from a German. I can say this.
Hey, you're the one saying it,
I'm a German
not me,
as well, so I'm allowed to say this.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think there's there's a problem that different governments share, which is they need to save money. And if AI is the way to do that, and the DOGE style, I think the Dutch ministries are also thinking about using more AI, using more chatbots. But the question is then how? So I'm not saying don't use anything, but make sure that you still can protect your values. And the DOGE approach doesn't strike me as doing that.
Yeah, but we just heard the question from the lady here in the front that she said, well, what should we do? And then we should discuss if we want it, how we want it, what kind of value should be inserted into the AI. But it's already here, so it feels like, paperwork, or I don't know. We're really lagging behind then. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Totally. Yeah. But I think what your point about alternative social media platforms is also crucial here, because they facilitate a different type of debate, also about these topics.
Yeah. You want to elaborate, or?
No, I mean, if we think about the kind of spaces in which we might experience deliberative democracy, then we hopefully want to be having those discussions in spaces in which the democratic ideas that are being discussed is happening within a system in which that is supported. But I think then feeling like we exist within these walled gardens makes it difficult. And if so much about what makes social media appealing is the fact that the people that we know and are connected to are already there, this kind of issue of needing to mass migrate emerges. And I think we've started to see people doing that. I think the fact that Signal is the #1 downloaded app currently in the Netherlands suggests that people want something different and are exploring that option.
So someone here in the front as well. I'll go bring you the box.
So you're talking about these chatbots used by the government, and it can be more efficient, of course. So it might not. Maybe it's a good idea because we have more value for our community. But the worries are about that these generative AI, these chatbots, we don't understand what's happening inside. And there might be ideology inside that's not our ideology, or that's not very positive. But so I think we should, the idea that comes up is that we should treat these chatbots as humans, like, who am I asking this? Am I asking something at the other side of the ocean that I don't know? So we should treat them as we want the answers from the people that we trust and that we know. So we need the chatbots that we trust and that we know how they work. And it's not very difficult. You can just create your chatbot and instruct them what kind of ideology or what kind of rules they should apply. So we can just use chatbots that are not bad, you know. Chatbots are not bad. You can just create really honest and chatbots with good values. So that's something that I don't hear yet. Don't you believe in that?
Yep. Even when you do that, it will be quite difficult for the chatbot to portray empathy, for example, or human judgment in certain situation. And then it depends if in high stakes context, for example, social service payments, for example, or immigration, if chatbots decide and they don't have any empathy, the question is, do we want that? But however, your point about chatbots being efficient, maybe more in low stakes context, where people don't want to do that work, public sector employees, it's too mundane, for example, and you can replace that with chatbot. Maybe that's a better point, but when empathy is required, I would be careful. But
yeah, so you were talking also about what is behind the AI and how do they become the AI that they are. So I actually, yesterday there was an email sent by Facebook. I don't know if you use their services, but it said something about we want to inform you about how we are using your data to train our AI. As a user, I was like, oh, I didn't know you were doing that, but okay. So there was also, I found a news article about that. So they resumed the AI training, but they are using our public user data after the regulator gave approval for it in the end. So the chatbox or the AI is being trained on what I put on Facebook, or what we are saying even in WhatsApp to each other. I think that is also important to know, and there is not a whole lot we can do about that then, if we agree to the terms and services. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. That once, because of the way that the kind of model works, right? If you click yes, I accept these terms and conditions, then you do open yourself up to this. But when there are big kind of changes, the platform does have an obligation to inform you as a user. And then there's kind of, I guess, this is where discretion comes in terms of when the platform's going to decide this is a significant enough change, for example, to their privacy policy, that they are obligated to inform you. So I guess this is what makes social media platforms great spaces in which AI models can be developed and trained, because they have access to so much user data. Yeah. And I see that OpenAI has just been developing their own social media, right? To do this very thing of how do we get access to good data? Well, if we have a social media platform where people are giving away their data, suddenly that opens up possibilities.
Yeah, because according to Facebook, they say this training will better support millions of people and businesses in Europe by teaching our generative AI models to better understand and reflect their cultures, languages, and history. Well, that sounds very noble, of course. And then the people from Bits of Freedom, which is an organization in the Netherlands, said, well, it's sort of like people coming into your house and rating your photos and taking them and say that we're going to do cool stuff with that. And we don't really know what that cool stuff is. So it's also a really weird way to frame, they're taking our data, but we're not really knowing what they're doing with it. So
I mean, I would say that this is something that we might have seen before. If you're a Facebook, Instagram user, you might have got sent a memory one day, right? That says, on this day 10 years ago, this was what you were doing. That I've done some work kind of looking at that memory model. And this was a way that they got to develop their image recognition software, because this provided people interacting with this feature and giving it feedback, right? The decision you might make to share it, to send it to a friend. Maybe you reshared it and you added a caption to it. This is all part of their models learning how to identify objects within an image, because even though we think about our photos as being these like personal things that matter to us and these conversation as being ours, this is data that does it simultaneously is something that is data that can be used in this way. And so we have these kind of personal attachments to it that I think makes it difficult to remember that this is something that is going into a commercial entity who are going to be using it to do this sort of thing, even though it feels a bit creepy.
Yeah.
Or a lot creepy.
Yeah. So, Fabian, is this a way for AI to become maybe more empathetic, or like pretend to be empathetic because they know what I respond to, how I respond in WhatsApp?
I think this example shows very well that the term artificial intelligence is actually misleading, because what we have is collective intelligence. This is the accumulated intelligence or knowledge of many, many people.
Yeah.
And that's why I used the historical example of factory owners, like Carnegie. He made us think that wealth and progress comes back to individuals. And today we discuss tech bros again as individuals, but we need to remember that it's the collective labor, connective knowledge of people that powers what we call AI. And of course, that works very well in social media networks.
But can you, I don't know how AI really works, but if they are getting access to my WhatsApp history and my Facebook, how would people who use generative AI, how would that, and everybody else's information as well, what would that give the model? Or how would a user feel that? Or
well, it's all about finding patterns, and your user behavior might relate to a pattern about your specific demographic. So I don't know how old you are, and I'm not going to make any speculations,
40,
but
okay.
you will be put in this category of people that share your demographic details, basically, and then you can create personalized advertisement based on that. And a few years ago with social media, there was a saying, if the product is free to use, then you are the product. So you're the product when you use or when you provide data for AI training.
okay. Yay. A question. Anyone? Yeah, here in the front. Who has the black box? Yes.
Thanks. So looking at what's going on here, we've known for a few years already that companies like Meta with products like Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp or Twitter, they are not beneficial to society. There are huge adverse effects that we're seeing. And in the EU, we've got this knee-jerk reaction that we'll just use a regulatory hammer to try to weed all of this out. But at the same time, at a certain point, maybe we should, if you're still using Facebook or WhatsApp in 2025, then maybe you are also complicit in what's going on. Is there a way to kickstart this more cultural and more personal responsibility discussion to make it more of a collective decision to ditch these platforms rather than have a lawmaker try to handle this?
I mean, I think I'll come back to what you first said, right? That this is inherently negative and has adverse effects. Because I think that narrative also perhaps overlooks the fact that people get benefits and pleasure out of using these social media platforms, that we're not entirely duped into giving away our data and getting absolutely nothing in return and just being exploited. I think there is real value, personal, social, cultural value that we obtain from this. Even if it's only entertainment, that still matters. And so I think we can't entirely disentangle that from the fact that it's also having negative implications, civic implications, all these other kind of consequences. So I think then to say that we should just opt out and turn it off without thinking about alternatives isn't really an attractive proposition. But I think it is a matter of questioning whether collectively we want to make change. Because me as an individual stopping to use a platform, and yet perhaps all the other people I'm connected to in my life are, so I'm from New Zealand, all my friends back home are on Instagram. For me to opt out, am I affecting Mark Zuckerberg in any way, or am I just now disconnected from people who I love and care about and want to be connected with in some particular way? So I do think it is a really messy problem filled with contradictions and paradoxes, that we can be ideologically opposed to these things, and yet if we only put it onto the individual level and need to make sacrifices at that level, I don't know whether that is the most effective route. I think it is about thinking collectively and thinking critically about platforms at the same time, because perhaps for some people who became kind of sucked into these systems, it was so inevitable and it was so just the thing that we all did that perhaps people didn't think about these kind of terms and conditions. So I don't know, Fabian, if you have additional thoughts. No? You sure? Yeah.
Do you have a response? You don't use WhatsApp, for example, or any other of these platforms because of that reason?
I've moved away from WhatsApp. Don't use it anymore. I still use LinkedIn. I will admit to that. I truly understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
I feel like we're maybe locked into a tragedy of the commons type of situation where collectively we can't move away from this, even though collectively it might be for the better. I think it was in the news like a week ago that teens nowadays, like most teens, would prefer if Instagram and TikTok didn't exist, yet everyone is still addicted to their phone. I don't know. It's a difficult problem to solve, and I think we also individually need to be more conscious of this.
Yeah. So there was talk about the regulatory hammer. Of course, Europe is big on regulations, but it seems that they're also retracting a bit even in the last few days after the tariff debacle and threats, I think you could say, from Vance, for example. How do you see the future of EU regulations?
Very uncertain, because the Trump administration is going to use the threat of retaliatory action as a leverage. So they might say, or J.D. Vance, Trump, if the AI Act, DSA, is enforced against Elon Musk companies, for example, or X in that case, we will do X. So we will impose tariffs on you again, or increase tariffs. So I think we need to go back to the Trump as a deal maker, which also relates to the government as a corporation. And that's the way the negotiations are going to go. It's about making deals with a deal maker that's very good at making deals. And we need to see how we can do that. But I think it's very uncertain how it will be enforced with all this geopolitical context.
You want to add something? Or?
No, I was just going to say that we can also look at what's happening with Trump in relation to TikTok, and how TikTok has also become part of this chip that is being used between as the US is negotiating or not negotiating with China around tariffs, and that the TikTok ban not being enforced is part of that, because of that ByteDance has said that it would be perhaps willing to lease the TikTok algorithm if the sale went through, and now China is saying, okay, but you need to come to the table on other things. So I think this is another way in which we can see a similar-ish dynamic being played out when suddenly big tech companies are being used, or governments are needing to negotiate on the behalf of big tech.
But then it's also good that we have the DSA, AI Act and Digital Markets Act in place, because that's again leverage from the EU side.
Absolutely.
Like that's okay. We can enforce this if you don't do X. So I would say yes, you can complain about over-regulation, but it's good to have that now.
Yeah, concrete measures in which they've said, if you don't do this, then these are the kind of fines that you can expect. So, yeah.
Yeah, behind you.
Before we had the AI Act and so on, we had GDPR.
Can you really speak into the microphone?
Before the AI, we had the GDPR regulations and so on. And when you showed the picture of China, US, and Europe, I was thinking he's going to say something on GDPR. Who owns the data? In China, it's the government. In America, it's the techbros, as you call them. And in Europe, we are the owner, ourselves. Is there a correlation between this discussion? Because I think that's the starting point. Who owns the data? And second, what we do in Dutch schools now is we take away their phones during school hours. So people start to think themselves again. And then it's not bad to have the social media, but you have to consider you're thinking yourself. So 2 questions, sorry for that.
Yeah. So first, it's about ownership of data. So in China, it's the government. For all the other platforms, it's tech bros. And in Europe, it's Europe. Well, not really.
I also have to admit I'm focusing more on infrastructure, less on data, so I am not qualified to speak about that. But yeah, you're completely right that data, you can't look at infrastructure without looking at data as well. And GDPR, you can say that the EU also had a global impact with different governments following the EU approach, what is sometimes called the Brussels effect. So what the EU is doing is being replicated across the globe as well. And of course, data ownership is a crucial topic, but maybe you know more about that.
Well, the thing that I was going to add is that all these companies, if they're operating in the EU, have to be complying with the GDPR. And so we can see that just because perhaps we have more ways of extracting our data back and gaining visibility about how much data is being collected about us, that doesn't necessarily stop the way that it's being used and monetized. And so, of course, the GDPR has definitely made strides in that case. But I don't think, yes, we might have higher levels of protection in some cases being in the EU, but this has not fundamentally changed the way that these companies are operating here. And then to your second point, I think that is a vital part of the equation, is thinking about how habitual our use of all these platforms are. And once you kind of break the habit, perhaps rather than, I think using habits and habitual use is perhaps more productive than talking about addiction. But once we change our habits and our kind of dependencies and reliances, we can start to see kind of alternative ways of socializing, of interacting, of being. And so then I think this is the same when we think about how integrated perhaps generative AI becomes within our personal lives, within our work lives, if we have choice over that, and what kind of patterns we allow to emerge in order to think about how locked in we come from the outset, and perhaps using social media use as an example to reflect on how we integrate different technologies could be really valuable.
Yeah, so if we take a look at the national level in the Netherlands, recently the Dutch parliament called for an end to dependence on the US software companies. There was an article in the NRC, it is in Dutch, but it was about the digital dependency on the US again, and that we're actually being too fatalistic about it. And also on our own UU website, it is Albert Meijer and José van Dijk who are saying, why are we using Microsoft software on the university? So maybe you want to go first, Fabian, to comment on this.
We're using Microsoft software because it's cheaper and more convenient than alternatives. And we actually, it's actually very hard to find out how much the university is paying to Microsoft. So I was trying to find out, but it's not straightforward. So even the licensing agreements are a bit black-boxed here. And I think that might be a useful starting point, finding out how much an institution like the UU, paid by taxpayers, so everyone in the room, where is this money, how is this money being channeled into Microsoft, and how much money? I would like to know that as well.
We have a question, sorry.
Yeah. No, it's okay. Okay, so can the black box go to the lady in blue? Wow, good throw.
Oh. How about Linux and alternatives?
Yeah, so this is also about operating systems, of course.
Again, not qualified to say this, but I know that the open source community is a big fan of Linux, of course, and open source is always a good alternative to proprietary tech.
And I mean, as employees at Utrecht, we are kind of, the way in which we do communication, for example, is facilitated through the Microsoft suite. So I think even then to choose to go outside of that and the kind of frictions that could create mean
problem with colleagues.
Yeah, exactly. And the way that things have become standardized and seamless to kind of, move through this kind of suite means that, trying to do something different as an individual, you could run into kind of barriers of all sorts of scale.
Yeah, so this question about how to be more autonomous when it comes to all these platforms and the software, it's very, once you start thinking about it, it's like it's everywhere. This is a presentation on PowerPoint. This is an Apple's MacBook. We are all using it. We all have the devices in our pocket. So it does feel a bit overwhelming to, to see all this and think, oh, we should do it differently. And we should really talk about how we're going to do it. But I mean, I get that we're too fatalistic, but I also get it. Are you feeling more optimistic about the future or less optimistic after tonight's talk?
Oh, well, no, I'm going to say I feel optimistic in terms of that people like us perhaps want change, right? And that if we felt like it didn't matter, if we became apathetic and we just said, that's just the way it is, there's no point in thinking or talking about it, that would be a different scenario. I think it feels really challenging to think about what it would look like to have this particular event, right, outside of all these platforms and companies and dependencies. But I think there are possibilities. We see evidence in small places, and it's about how that might be connected. And like the earlier comment about the fact we are all complicit, or perhaps we're all implicated within this. And that's something that I think is an uncomfortable position to be in, because I don't know, I like to think that I'm an ethical person, whatever that might mean, and yet I become tied in so many different aspects of my life. So, yeah.
You, Fabian, do you have...
I think good ideas often develop as a consequence of bad ideas, and we see that in history. That's why I like the industrial age example. A lot of the worker movement and worker rights movement was developed in opposition to the opposite ideology of the capitalist that are the wealth producers. So I think if we look at history as dialectic, as movement that with oppositions and contradictions, then the current moment is also a golden opportunity to develop alternative visions about tech in society, and we are already doing that, and let's see if we have the money and resources to also put it in practice.
Yeah. Is there anybody? Who has the box? Yeah. Oh, you already have it. Great.
Have
fantastic.
It, yeah. Oh, wow, that's loud. Hi. Actually, that's not really a question. More of
it's okay.
Let's say giving a glimmer of hope.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, I work with a lot of Linux and open source solutions for a lot of mostly company or governmental things. I also see that there are a lot of tools and open source stuff you can use as alternatives for social media. And there's a lot out there. There are solutions. Oh, great, nice.
Thank you for the segue. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Well, I think a small problem in that there's not the people usually give those solutions for free or slight license things you need to buy. But there's not really a big of a marketing there, I guess, because people just give it away for free. There's no really money to be earned, so there's not a big marketing or anything. So I guess maybe that's something we could solve with each other, in a way.
We need more marketing power for all these EU-based tech companies. Is that what you're saying? Or open source. Yeah. But should the open source company then also be based in the EU, or doesn't that matter anymore once it's open source? Or how does that work? Is everything from the US bad now? Is that it, or?
No, we also have open source language models already in the EU, for example, from Mistral AI, a French company. So anyone can use that, download that, build on that. But you're completely right that in terms of marketing, there's a lot to catch up. And again, big tech are very, very good at building products and selling products. And I think we can learn here as well, or alternatives can learn from that communication style as well.
Yeah, so this is EU-based, and I see now that I'm just really interested in the messaging apps because it's what I use most. But so Signal is also not okay then because it's not EU.
No, the foundation is not based in the EU. But I don't think necessarily, maybe this is as a non-European, that I would say...
do you have any New Zealand startups that we can...
I don't. But I would say that, US equals bad, China equals bad, is also not... is too simplistic, of a narrative. And so I think what Signal is doing feels... very productive in terms of deliberately setting themselves up as a non-profit. And so I don't think we only need to look at what's happening within the EU as providing viable alternatives, but it is about being critical of what kind of data policies they have in place, what kind of ownership structures.
And it's not run by a tech bro, but a tech sis. Is that the problem, maybe?
Well, I think
it's a woman, right? Who's the head of?
I think Of course, the tech bro kind of landscape is very male dominated, but there are women who are part of it who prop it up in particular ways and buy in. If you think about the kind of lean in movement coming out of Facebook, that there are. I don't think just because you put a woman in charge, things inherently get better. No. Because these ideologies are complex and inherently patriarchal in some ways. But I think it is interesting to reflect on who is in charge and what kind of, I guess, to go back to Fabian's point about values, what kind of values that they hold, right? And that could be something that we focus on.
Yeah.
But, I don't know if the rise of the tech girl boss is the solution.
No,
necessarily.
I was just wondering, do you want to is there something you want to say to the audience that you haven't said yet before we... Have you said everything that you wanted to? We can go to one more last question if you have any. Yeah, there, on the side. Yeah. Oh.
Yeah, I was just wondering, like before with the way that they say that AI is trained, of course, by all the data that comes in from all the users. But then if lots of people who are more skeptical or more ethical think, oh, we should move away from these platforms, do we then also run the risk that AI gets trained less with also critical ideas?
Yeah.
Great point. I haven't considered that. If many people boycott, of course, this can happen with what you're describing, and I think it's a really interesting, thought-provoking idea. Yeah.
Mail from Facebook.
Yeah, as well. Yeah.
So my first reaction was like, yes, I'm canceling all of that. You're not getting my permission. But then it was like, well, if all people that are more critical don't give permission for their data to be used, then does AI not even
You're so empathetic with the AI models. Although run out of juice.
we should all use AI. Anyway.
Yeah.
But you can look at X, and many people left X, went to Blue Sky, and then look at what is happening at X. So maybe that's what's happening inside the model. Some weird mix.
Okay, so before we go to a last applause, I just want to focus on some two more events here at the Utrecht Library that you might also find interesting if you are interested in big tech and alternatives. So this is an alternative for social media of big tech. So I think maybe some of you might also want to go there. It is in Dutch though. And there's also more feiten en bullshit van de AI hype. So if you want to know more and also join the AI bullshit bingo from Setup, you can go there. So for now, I really want to ask you to give one last applause for our speakers today, Fabian Ferrari and Taylor Annabelle. And I hope to see you at more events of Studium Generale. And if you could take the time to scan this barcode and or what is it, QR code, sorry, and let us know what you thought of this, then we'll have also some more input for our models to make our product better. So see you.